My uncle walked into our house the night my dad died, smelled like beer, and said, "Guess you guys are screwed now. Without him, you'll probably lose everything." When I confronted him years later, he laughed and said, "Good luck proving she didn't sign it." I just stared at him. That was 11 months ago. This morning, he was standing in court with his head down. My uncle laughed when my dad died and said we'd lose everything. Now he pays rent to live in my basement. When I was 16, my dad died suddenly from a heart attack. It was the worst day of my life, and unfortunately, that day also showed me just how rotten some people in my family really were. My dad had built everything we had, our home, his small construction company, a comfortable savings account. He wasn't flashy or loud about it, but he worked his butt off to make sure my mom and I were secure. The night he died, our house was full of relatives and neighbors who came to comfort us. Some actually meant it. Others were there to sniff around. Enter my Uncle Robert, my dad's younger brother. He walked in late, smelling like beer, and with zero sense of decency. He took one look around and smirked at me. "Guess you guys are screwed now," he said casually, as if he was talking about the weather. "Without him, you'll probably lose everything." I froze. My mom's face went pale, but Robert just strolled to the kitchen like he hadn't just kicked a grieving widow and her teenage kid in the gut. The days that followed were worse. He started offering advice to my mom about selling the house to downsize, or letting him take over the business because you can't run it without a man. He'd say it in this fake sympathetic voice, but it was so obvious he was circling for scraps. He told neighbors we were drowning in debt. We weren't. He hinted to other family members that mom couldn't keep the house up for long. I overheard him telling a cousin, "Don't get too attached to that place. The bank will take it." Then came the final straw. At my dad's memorial, I saw him laughing with someone, actually laughing, and I caught the tail end of his sentence. Death really changes the pecking order. That moment burned itself into my memory. I promised myself that one day, if I ever had the chance, I'd make him eat those words. Fast forward 12 years. I'm 28 now. My mom and I didn't lose the house. I went to college thanks to my dad's savings. I started my own career in real estate, worked like hell, and eventually owned several rental properties. Robert, on the other hand, burned his life to the ground. He hopped between get-rich-quick schemes, gambled away most of what he earned, got divorced twice, and alienated nearly everyone in the family. One day, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance. "Just so you know, Robert's getting evicted, can't pay rent, has nowhere to go." At first, I wasn't going to get involved, but then I remembered that smirk, that laugh, that comment about losing everything, and suddenly, I had the perfect idea. I called him. "Hey, I heard you're looking for a place," I said casually. He sounded tired. "Yeah, know anyone with something cheap? Times are rough." I did my best to keep the smile out of my voice. "I've got a basement unit available. Nothing fancy but clean. $800 a month, utilities included." He hesitated. "That's kinda steep. You could do better for family, right?" "Oh, don't worry," I said. "You'll find it worth it." 2 weeks later, he moved in. He didn't even ask who owned the place. But 3 days after moving, I was upstairs working when I heard heavy banging on the ceiling. I went down to find him standing at the door, glaring. "You own this place?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yep," I said, leaning casually against the wall, his face twisted. "So I'm paying you rent?" "Looks that way," I replied. He stared at me for a second before saying, "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Not as much as you enjoyed laughing at my dad's funeral," I said evenly. That shut him up. He went back inside without another word. Over the next few months, he kept his distance. He always paid on time, probably because he knew I'd have no hesitation kicking him out. He stopped making snide comments, but the resentment was obvious. One time, he tried to hint that I should lower his rent since we're family. The irony is, to outsiders, he spins the story like I'm some saint for helping him out with a place to live. He never mentions that he's paying me rent. He never mentions what he said to me and my mom the night my dad died. But last week, I came home to find a strange car parked in my driveway. Inside my basement unit, Robert was sitting at the table with a man in a suit, real estate papers spread out between them. And when they saw me, they both stopped talking. The guy in the suit cleared his throat and started gathering up the papers real quick, while Robert stood up and forced this fake smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just going over some rental agreements," Robert said, but his hands were shaking as he helped stuff documents into a briefcase. The suit guy, who introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, shook my hand with a grip that was way too firm and said he specialized in real estate law before practically running out of my basement. I watched Robert's face go from red to white as he mumbled something about needing to get to work and disappeared into his room. Something was definitely up, but I had bigger things to worry about when Mom called me the next day saying Robert had stopped by her place, offering to help her save money on taxes by adding me as co-owner on her house deed. She thought it was sweet of him to think about her finances, but the timing felt way too convenient after catching him with those papers. I started asking around, and my cousin Jessica texted me 2 days later asking if Mom was okay because Robert had been telling people at a family barbecue that she seemed confused lately and might need help managing her money. My stomach dropped when I read that text because I knew exactly what he was trying to do. A week later, I sat in my attorney's office as she ran searches on Mom's property, checking for any liens or claims that might have been filed without our knowledge. "Nothing yet," she said, tapping her computer screen. "But these schemes move fast once they get rolling, so you need to stay alert." Walking back to my car, I nearly jumped when Robert appeared beside me all smiles, asking if I needed help fixing the basement water heater and suggesting we grab a beer to put the past behind us. The complete personality switch from months of cold resentment made my skin crawl, but I played along just to see what he was up to. I installed a security camera in the basement common area that week, and sure enough, 2 days later while I was at work, the footage showed Brennan coming back with a whole folder of documents. They sat at that same table for 2 hours, papers spread everywhere, Robert signing document after document, while Brennan pointed at different spots on the pages. I couldn't make out the details from the camera angle, but Robert's eager nodding and the stack of papers he signed made my blood run cold. 3 days later, Mom called me crying and screaming that she'd gotten a notice from Milwaukee Home Equity Lenders about a loan application for $200,000 against her house. She swore she never applied for any loan, but the application listed Robert as her financial advisor with power power of attorney over her accounts. I grabbed the papers she'd faxed me and drove straight to her house, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The signature on those loan documents looked exactly like Mom's, but she kept shaking her head saying she never signed anything like that. Then she froze and whispered that the notary seal was dated 3 weeks ago, the same day Robert had stopped by just to chat and brought her favorite coffee and donuts. We drove straight to the bank where the manager took one look at the documents and said they'd investigate, but warned it could take weeks while the loan stayed in processing. Mom broke down in the car afterward, sobbing that she should have listened when I warned her about Robert years ago, admitting through tears that he'd always been jealous of Dad's success, but she never thought he'd come after us like this. 2 days later, I hired a private investigator who called me within hours to report that Robert had been spotted meeting with at least 4 different real estate attorneys and 3 hard money lenders around Milwaukee in the past month. The next morning, the investigator called with something that made my blood run cold. He'd found paperwork showing Robert had created an LLC called Walker Family Properties just last month, and the crazy part was he'd used my childhood home address, Mom's house, as the official business address. The investigator sent me screenshots of the state filing, and there it was in black and white, Robert listing himself as the sole owner of a company that sounded like it owned my mom's property. I immediately started digging into the notary who'd supposedly witnessed Mom's signature on those loan documents and tracked her down to a small office on the south side. When I walked in and showed her the paperwork, her face went white, and she started talking fast about how Robert had brought in an elderly woman who barely spoke and seemed really confused. The woman she described, quiet and uncertain, was nothing like my sharp mom who still does the crossword puzzle every morning and runs her book club with an iron fist. That night I couldn't sleep, and around 2 in the morning, I heard Robert's voice coming up through the floor vents from the basement. He was on the phone, and I pressed my ear to the floor to hear better, and caught pieces of his conversation saying he just needed 2 more weeks, and she wouldn't know until it was too late, and something about the nephew getting suspicious but not being able to prove anything. My hands were shaking as I recorded the conversation on my phone, and the next morning, I went straight downstairs and pounded on his door. When he opened it looking annoyed, I held up my phone and told him I knew everything about the fake LLC and the confused woman at the notary and his little scheme to steal Mom's house. I wonder what Robert's really thinking right now, caught red-handed with all those fake documents and schemes. He went from mocking a grieving family to begging for cheap rent, and now he's trying to steal from the same people he said would lose everything. He just looked at me for a second, then started laughing. That same cruel laugh from Dad's funeral 12 years ago, and said, "I thought I was so smart, but Mom's signature was on everything, and good luck proving she didn't sign it." Before I could respond, my phone rang, and it was the fraud department from the bank where Robert had applied for the loan. They'd found major problems with the application, including completely fake income documents, and were freezing everything while they investigated. 3 days later, I walked into the police station and filed reports for fraud and elder abuse, showing them everything I'd gathered. The detective, an older guy who seemed tired, took all my evidence, but warned me that family disputes were complicated, and Robert would probably claim Mom gave him permission, which would make it a civil matter, not criminal. That afternoon, Robert got the official denial letter from the bank, and within minutes, he was stomping up my stairs and banging on my door, screaming about how I was sabotaging family. When I mentioned the police report, his face went completely pale before he recovered and started yelling again about how I'd regret this. Mom and I spent the next day going through all her accounts, changing every password and adding fraud alerts to everything. She kept apologizing for not listening when I'd warned her about Robert years ago, and at one point, she grabbed my hand and said Dad would never let him get away with this. The investigator called again that evening with more bad news because he'd uncovered that Robert owed $80,000 in gambling debts to some seriously dangerous people. The timeline matched perfectly with when he'd started this whole scheme against Mom, which meant he was desperate enough to do anything. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Thomas Brennan, that lawyer Robert had been meeting with in my basement. The letter claimed I was harassing his client and interfering with legitimate business dealings, and if I didn't stop spreading lies about Robert immediately, they would sue me for defamation. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash because threats weren't going to stop me from protecting my mom. A week later, Linda called me out of the blue and said she needed to talk about Robert. We met at a coffee shop downtown where she slid a folder across the table filled with bank statements and court documents from their divorce 5 years ago. She pointed to several signatures that were supposed to be hers but clearly weren't, and told me Robert had tried to take out loans in her name during their marriage. The worst part was when she showed me credit card applications he'd filled out using their kids' social security numbers, including Angela, who was only 19 at the time. Linda agreed to write a sworn statement for the detective about everything Robert had done to her and their children. When I got home that afternoon, I noticed Robert's truck in the driveway, but he wasn't outside like usual. Through my kitchen window, I could see him pacing in the basement, constantly checking his phone and jumping every time a car drove by. Something was definitely eating at him, and whatever deadline he was facing with his creditors must have been getting close. The next day, our lawyer called with good news because the forensic document examiner had finished analyzing Mom's signatures. The expert confirmed what we already knew, that the power of attorney's signature was fake because the pressure patterns and letter formations didn't match any of Mom's real signatures from that time period. I was organizing all this evidence at my kitchen table when my phone rang and Angela's name popped up on the screen. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first, but then she managed to tell me she'd been getting collection calls all week. 3 credit cards had been opened in her name and maxed out at $5,000 each, and she had no idea how anyone got her social security number. I told her about what her mom had shown me, and that's when she broke down, completely realizing her own father had stolen her identity. Angela drove drove over that night, and we called Detective Mason together to add her case to the growing pile of fraud charges against Robert. The detective said having multiple victims made this much stronger because it wasn't just a family dispute anymore, but a pattern of criminal behavior. 3 days later, I spent hours at my dining room table sorting through everything we'd gathered, including forged documents and bank statements and witness testimonies. The stack of evidence kept growing thicker, and I remembered what Dad always said about documenting everything when dealing with difficult people. That same week, Robert must have realized the walls were closing in because he started calling relatives claiming I was persecuting him out of greed. My cousin Beth called asking why I was being so harsh to someone who was already down on his luck, and my Aunt Martha said Robert told her I was trying to steal his inheritance. Then Mom called me panicking because she'd gotten another letter this time from a company called Midwest Property Solutions claiming she'd agreed to sell her house for $300,000. The house was worth at least $450,000, and the contract had her signature dated just 2 weeks ago when she'd been with me the entire time. Our attorney immediately filed for an emergency injunction to stop any property transfers, and the judge granted it, but warned we needed to prove the fraud fast. The stress was taking its toll on Mom, who wasn't sleeping and had barely eaten anything in days, so I hired a home health aide named Carol to check on her daily. Carol was a retired nurse who dealt with elder abuse cases before and knew exactly what signs to watch for if Robert tried to approach Mom directly. 4 days later, Detective Mason called me with news that made my stomach drop. He'd been tailing Robert all week and just watched him walk into a warehouse on the south side of Milwaukee, known for loan shark operations. Through his telephoto lens, he got photos of Robert meeting with 2 men in leather jackets who looked like they broke legs for a living. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, and when Robert came out, his face was white as paper, and his hands were shaking so bad he dropped his car keys twice. Mason followed him back to my house, where Robert sat in his car in the driveway for 15 minutes, just staring at nothing before finally going down to the basement. That same afternoon, I decided to check the browser history on the old desktop computer I kept in the basement storage area that Robert had been using. What I found made me sick. He'd spent hours researching articles about dementia and mental competency evaluations. There were dozens of tabs open about how to prove someone was mentally unfit to manage their own affairs. He'd even looked up specific Wisconsin laws about guardianship and printed out forms for declaring someone incompetent. The search history went back weeks, with queries getting more and more specific about how to take control of an elderly parent's finances. 3 nights later, I woke up at 3 a.m. to weird noises coming from downstairs. I pulled up the security camera app on my phone and watched Robert moving around the basement in the dark with just a flashlight. He was pulling boxes out of the storage closet and stuffing papers into garbage bags. His movements were frantic, and he kept checking his phone like he was waiting for something. I could see stacks of documents spread across his bed and more papers scattered on the floor. Was he planning to run? I threw on clothes and went downstairs, but stayed quiet outside his door, listening. I could hear him muttering to himself about needing more time and something about Tuesday being too soon. The next morning, I waited until he left for his shift at the gas station, then moved my car to block his beat-up Honda in the driveway. When he got home that afternoon and saw he was trapped, he started yelling at me to move my car. I told him I wanted to see what was in those bags first. He tried to push past me toward the house, but I already had my phone out calling 911. The dispatcher could hear him screaming threats in the background and sent 2 squad cars immediately. When the cops arrived, Robert was still trying to get to those bags in his trunk. The officers separated us and asked what was going on. I explained about the fraud investigation and my suspicion that Robert was destroying evidence. They asked Robert for permission to search his vehicle, and when he refused, they called Detective Mason, who got a warrant within an hour. What they found in those bags was worse than I imagined. There were dozens of documents related to Mom's bank accounts, her mortgage papers, old tax returns, even her medical records from 10 years ago. Mixed in were property deeds for houses Mom had never owned and loan applications with her name on them. The officers bagged everything as evidence and found something that made Mason whistle low. Hidden between legitimate documents were sheets and sheets of paper where Robert had been practicing Mom's signature. There were probably 50 attempts showing how he'd slowly gotten better at copying her handwriting. Some of the later ones were so good I couldn't tell the difference. Mason arrested him right there in my driveway for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. A week later, the district attorney's office called to say they were pursuing criminal charges on all 3 counts. The prosecutor said with the evidence we had, Robert was looking at serious prison time. They scheduled the arrest for that afternoon and asked if I wanted to be present. I said yes. Watching them handcuff Robert in the same basement apartment where he'd laughed about my family losing everything felt like karma finally catching up. He didn't say a word as they read him his rights, but his eyes were full of rage. Robert practicing Mom's signature 50 times like he's studying for the world's worst spelling test really shows his dedication to crime. Nothing says trustworthy family member quite like a trunk full of forged documents and midnight paper shredding parties in the basement. The next day, he posted bail using money nobody could trace, and the judge set conditions including no contact with Mom or Angela. But since he was technically a paying tenant, the judge said he could stay in the basement until trial. Having him back in my house after his arrest felt wrong, but my lawyer said evicting him now could hurt our case. We had to play by the rules even if Robert never did. That Sunday, Mom came over for dinner and seemed more like herself than she had in weeks. Carol the aide had been doing a great job keeping her calm and making sure she ate properly. While I served the pot roast, Mom looked at me with clear eyes and said she'd been thinking about Dad. She said he would probably laugh at the irony of Robert paying me rent while trying to steal from us. It was the first time she'd made a joke since this whole mess started. 2 days later, Thomas Brennan officially withdrew as Robert's attorney, citing irreconcilable differences. Word had already spread through Milwaukee's legal community about the forged documents, and no decent lawyer wanted to touch the case. Robert spent the next week calling every defense attorney in the phone book, but they all turned him down once they heard the details. He ended up with a public defender fresh out of law school who looked terrified at the preliminary hearing. That's when Angela called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. She'd been trying to refinance her car loan when the bank told her about the credit cards. Not 3 cards like we thought, but 7 different accounts all maxed out. The total debt was $45,000. Her credit score had dropped 300 points, and the bank was denying her refinance. But the worst part was she was supposed to close on her first house next month. She'd saved for 5 years for that down payment, and now the mortgage company was pulling out because of her destroyed credit. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at Angela's kitchen table surrounded by stacks of paperwork while she made phone call after phone call to credit agencies. Each company wanted different forms and proof that she hadn't opened these accounts herself. Experian needed a police report plus 3 forms of ID. TransUnion wanted notarized statements. Equifax kept transferring her to different departments. The woman on speaker from Capital One actually said she couldn't believe a father would do this to his own daughter, and maybe Angela was confused about who opened the accounts. Angela hung up and started crying again. I took over the calls while she went to make coffee. Meanwhile, Robert had started sliding notes under my door at night. The first one said he'd tell everyone about Dad's unpaid taxes if I didn't drop the charges. The next threatened to expose how Mom had been taking anxiety medication for years. Then came the begging ones about how he was family and Dad would be ashamed of me. I photographed each note with my phone and added them to the evidence folder without responding. The investigator called me 3 days later with news that made my stomach drop. Robert wasn't working alone. He'd been getting coached by Carl Novak, a developer who'd been running schemes targeting elderly homeowners for years. They found emails between them discussing how to approach Mom about selling the house. Carl had templates for fake documents and a whole system for moving money through shell companies. Robert was just one of several family members Carl was using to get to vulnerable relatives. That night, Mom called me crying and shaking. Someone had just tried to wire $50,000 from her savings to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The bank's fraud department caught it because of the alert I'd set up, but the scary part was the attempt came from our home IP address. Robert still had access to our Wi-Fi from the basement. I went straight to the electronics store and bought new routers, security cameras, and changed every password in the house. Robert banged on my door demanding to know why the internet wasn't working. I told him through the door that utilities didn't include Wi-Fi and he'd have to use his phone data. He kicked the door hard enough to leave a mark and stomped back downstairs. A week passed with him completely isolated down there, only coming up to get mail or buy food. Angela came over with a box of printed emails going back 5 years. Every single one was Robert asking for money with elaborate stories about car repairs, medical bills, investment opportunities. She pointed to one from 3 years ago where he'd asked for $10,000 for his daughter's wedding that never happened. Another claimed he needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. She looked at me with dead eyes and said he never saw her as his daughter, just a resource to drain. Detective Mason from Financial Crimes took over the case the next week. He'd dealt with family predators before and warned us Robert would probably try something desperate as the trial got closer. He was right. Mom got a call from a blocked number with someone claiming to be from her bank needing to verify her account. She recognized Robert's voice immediately, even though he was trying to disguise it. She hung up, but the damage was done because now she was scared to answer her own phone. The prosecutor added witness tampering charges at the next hearing. The judge revoked Robert's bail right there in the courtroom. 2 officers cuffed him while he screamed that we were destroying the family and Dad would never forgive us. They took him straight to county jail. I stood in the empty basement apartment that afternoon looking at the mess he'd left behind. Pizza boxes, empty bottles, scattered papers with his scribbled plans and schemes. The same space where 12 years ago he'd sat at my dad's funeral, planning how to take everything from us. The room felt lighter without him, but the weight of everything he'd done to Angela and Mom sat heavy on my chest. 3 weeks later, the prosecutor called with news that made my blood run cold. Robert had been making collect calls from jail to our cousin Dave, and during one of those recorded conversations, he'd basically confessed everything. Dave had been fishing for information, pretending to be sympathetic, and Robert fell for it completely. He told Dave that Mom would have signed those papers anyway if she knew how much he needed the money, and that forging her signature was just saving everyone time. The prosecutor played me the recording, and I could hear Robert's voice clear as day saying those exact words while Dave made encouraging noises on the other end. That same afternoon, Detective Mason called with even bigger news. Carl had been arrested in a completely separate fraud case involving 3 other elderly victims and their property deeds. The detective said Carl was looking at serious time, but was willing to testify against Robert in our case if it meant reducing his own sentence. The walls were closing in on my uncle faster than I ever imagined. 2 days later, Mom went for her court-ordered medical evaluation at the hospital. The doctor ran her through a bunch of tests, checking her memory and mental state, and Mom passed everything with flying colors. The report came back saying she was remarkably sharp for her age, with 0 signs of confusion or dementia, which completely destroyed Robert's plan to claim she wasn't competent when she supposedly signed those papers. While all this legal stuff was happening, Angela called me crying because the bank was threatening foreclosure on her house thanks to all the credit damage Robert had done with his identity theft. I spent the next 3 days working my real estate connections and found a lender who specialized in helping identity theft victims. They agreed to work with Angela, knowing her credit problems weren't her fault, and within a week, we had her refinanced at a decent rate that she could actually afford. 2 weeks after that, Robert's public defender reached out to the prosecutor trying to negotiate a plea deal. The offer was 3 to 5 years in prison if Robert pleaded guilty to all charges, including including the forgery and fraud. The prosecutor called me right after the meeting to tell me Robert had refused the deal and was insisting on going to trial because he still thought he could beat the charges. That decision turned out to be the worst one he could have made because over the next few days, more victims started coming forward. Two elderly relatives from Mom's side of the family contacted the detective saying Robert had approached them with suspicious documents over the past year. Neither had signed anything, but both said he pressured them hard, trying to get power of attorney or access to their bank accounts. The pattern was undeniable, and the prosecutor added these attempts to the case file. Mom started having nightmares after learning about all these other victims, waking up in the middle of the night, panicked that someone was breaking in to steal her house. I installed a complete security system with cameras and motion sensors, which helped her feel safer, but she still kept Dad's picture on her nightstand, and I'd hear her talking to it sometimes, asking him why his brother turned out so rotten. The trial date got set for next month, and Robert's calls from jail became increasingly desperate. He started calling me directly, offering to tell the truth about Dad's business dealings if we dropped the charges, claiming he knew things about how Dad built a company that would shock us. We didn't take the bait because we knew it was just Robert trying to create leverage where he had none. I spent a whole weekend cleaning out his stuff from the basement, and that's when I found the notebooks. 3 spiral notebooks hidden in a box under his bed, filled with our family's financial information going back years. Account numbers for Mom's savings property values for every house our relatives owned, insurance policy details, even social security numbers, all written in Robert's handwriting with notes about who would be the easiest targets. Robert getting bail to stay in the basement after arrest seems really convenient for someone who just forged documents. Makes me wonder if there's something about tenant rights the judge knows that we don't. He'd been planning this for way longer than we thought, probably since before he even moved into my basement. The last entry was dated 2 days before I caught him with that real estate guy in my kitchen. Angela came over to help me sort through everything, and when she saw those notebooks, she broke down completely. We decided she and Mom needed to meet properly and talk about everything Robert had done to both of them, so I set up coffee at a quiet place downtown. Watching them sit together was heartbreaking, as Mom apologized over and over for not protecting Angela from her father, even though Angela kept saying it wasn't Mom's fault. They both cried, holding each other's hands, talking about how Robert had betrayed them in different ways, but with the same selfish cruelty. A month later, I sat in the courtroom watching Robert shuffle in, wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He kept his eyes down and wouldn't look at any of us sitting in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. The prosecutor stood up and told the jury this was about a man who used his brother's death to steal from his own family. She called it a calculated betrayal of family trust that went on for years through fake documents and lies. Mom took the stand next and sat there with her hands folded, looking right at Robert the whole time she talked. She explained how he came to her after Dad died, pretending to help, but really just wanted to take everything we had. When she said he dishonored his brother's memory for money, Robert finally looked up and his face went red. The defense attorney got up and tried to make it sound like I set Robert up because I was still mad about stuff from when we were kids. He painted this picture of me as some rich landlord who trapped a desperate man just to get revenge. The jury members kept looking at each other and shaking their heads like they weren't buying it at all. Angela took the stand after lunch and completely broke down crying while she talked about how her dad's crimes ruined her college plans. She had to drop out because the money he promised her for tuition never existed since he'd spent it all on gambling. Several jury members were wiping their eyes and one older woman reached for tissues in her purse. Then Carl took a stand and dropped the biggest bomb of the whole trial. He pulled out printed emails where Robert bragged about having inside access to our family money through Mom's trust. The emails showed Robert explaining his whole plan to forge documents and steal Mom's house right out from under her. The defense attorney's face went white and he started shuffling through his papers like he was looking for something to counter with. The forensic document expert came next with huge blown-up copies of Mom's real signature next to the fake ones Robert made. She pointed out all the differences with a laser pointer, showing how the loops were wrong and the pressure marks didn't match. Robert's attorney tried to object, but the judge overruled him and told the expert to continue her testimony. During the afternoon recess, a bunch of our extended family members came up to us in the hallway outside the courtroom. They all apologized for not believing us before and said they could see now what kind of person Robert really was. My Aunt Catherine hugged Mom and said she was sorry for ever doubting her about the missing money from Grandma's estate. Against his lawyer's advice, Robert decided to take the stand himself, which was the stupidest thing he could have done. He sat there trying to explain that everyone just misunderstood what he was trying to do with the family assets. He claimed he was just trying to help manage things because Mom was too upset after Dad died to handle it herself. The prosecutor started her cross-examination and Robert got more and more flustered with each question she asked. Then she asked him point blank if Mom had actually signed those documents he filed with the county. Robert stammered and said of course she did, but then accidentally added that he knew she would have if she understood. The prosecutor jumped on that, asking him to repeat what he just said about knowing she would have signed. Robert tried to backtrack, but it was too late, and everyone in the courtroom heard him admit Mom never signed anything. His attorney put his head in his hands, and the jury members were all writing notes on their pads. In closing arguments, the prosecutor held up Robert's notebook that the detective had found during the search of his apartment. She opened it to pages covered with practice signatures, where Robert had been copying Mom's handwriting over and over. She told the jury this wasn't some misunderstanding or family dispute, but methodical, deliberate crime against his own family. 2 days later, we sat in the courtroom waiting for the verdict. Mom gripped my hand so tight it hurt, but I didn't pull away. The bailiff finally opened the door, and the jury filed back in. None of them looked at Robert, which the prosecutor had told us was a good sign. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. My heart pounded as he read guilty on the first count of fraud, then guilty on forgery, guilty on elder abuse, guilty on identity theft, theft. Robert's shoulders dropped with each word until he was slumped forward in his chair. His lawyer put a hand on his back, but Robert just stared at the table. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for next month. She ordered Robert held without bail since he was now a convicted felon who'd already shown he would target family members. 2 officers cuffed him, and as they led him past our row, he finally looked at me. No smirk this time, no smart comments, just empty defeat in his eyes. That same week, Angela called to tell me she'd been approved for her house with a new lender. She sent a photo from the closing table holding up her keys with the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. A month later, we were back for sentencing, and the courtroom was packed with Robert's victims. Mom stood at the podium and talked about losing trust in her own family. Angela described the months of credit repair and sleepless nights, wondering if she'd lose her kids' college funds. 3 other people Robert had scammed spoke about their losses. The judge listened to everything, then looked straight at Robert and called his crimes particularly heinous because he'd exploited family trust. She sentenced him to 7 years in state prison, plus restitution to all victims. Robert showed no emotion as they led him away in shackles. Our lawyer filed civil suits that week to recover damages and clear all the fraudulent documents from public records. The criminal conviction made it straightforward, but would still take months to process everything. Mom started sleeping through the night again once we installed the security system. She found a support group for fraud victims at the community center and went every Tuesday. 6 weeks into his sentence, I got a letter from Robert. Not an apology, but 3 pages of blame saying Dad had owed him for years of being the favorite son. He wrote that we'd stolen what was rightfully his and that karma would get us eventually. I filed it with all the other evidence in case we ever needed it. Finally, after 4 months of legal paperwork, the house title came back completely cleared of all fraudulent claims. Mom got the official documents confirming she was the sole owner with no liens or false transfers. She bought a nice frame and hung them on the wall right next to Dad's picture from when he'd first built the house. That night, she cooked his favorite meal, and we ate together at the kitchen table he'd made with his own hands. She looked at his empty chair and said he would have been proud of how we'd protected everything he'd worked for. I thought about Robert in his cell and felt nothing but relief that it was finally over. The weeks after Robert's sentencing blurred together in a strange mix of paperwork and healing. Angela called me one afternoon to say the credit bureaus had finally started removing the fraudulent accounts her dad had opened in her name. She'd found a small house on the south side of Milwaukee and was packing boxes while we talked. The moving truck arrived the next Saturday, and I helped her carry furniture up the narrow stairs. She'd chosen a place with big windows and fresh paint, nothing like the dark apartment where she'd lived under her father's shadow. Mom helped her hang curtains while I assembled her new kitchen table. That same week, I hired contractors to gut the basement apartment. They ripped out the old carpet Robert had stained with beer, tore down the walls where he'd punched holes during his rages, and hauled away every trace of his presence. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust replaced the stale cigarette smoke that had clung to everything. I stood in the empty space and decided to leave it vacant for now. The rental income wasn't worth keeping those memories alive. Mom started hosting Sunday dinners again, something she hadn't done since Dad died. Our cousins from Wauwatosa came, along with my dad's old construction crew who'd stood by us through everything. We filled the dining room with laughter and stories about Dad's terrible jokes. Nobody mentioned Robert's name. We passed dishes around the table Dad had built and focused on the family that actually mattered. Detective Mason called on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing property listings. Carl's whole operation had collapsed after Robert's arrest. The FBI had raided his offices and found evidence of dozens of similar schemes targeting elderly homeowners across Wisconsin. 3 other families had already come forward with stories just like ours. The detective said our case had been the key to breaking everything open. More people would keep their homes because we'd fought back. The anniversary of Dad's death came on a cold March morning. Robert's master plan included practice signatures like he was training for the world's worst talent show. Watch me forge my way to prison. The jury saw right through his amateur hour criminal performance faster than you can say guilty verdict. Mom and I drove to the cemetery together, stopping to buy flowers at the shop where Dad used to get her roses. The cemetery was quiet, except for the wind through the bare trees. Mom knelt by his headstone and told him everything that had happened. She told him about Robert's schemes, about the trial, about how we'd protected the house he'd built with his own hands. She traced his name on the stone and said he would have been proud. I squeezed her shoulder, and we stood there until the cold made our fingers numb. A thick envelope arrived from the State Victim Compensation Fund the following week. Mom and Angela would each receive partial restitution even before Robert could pay from prison. Mom held the check and shook her head. It wasn't about the money, she said, but having the state recognize what Robert had done to them meant something. Angela used her portion for a deposit on therapy sessions. She found a counselor who specialized in family betrayal and started going twice a week. She told me the hardest part was accepting that her father's crimes weren't her fault, that she didn't inherit his cruelty just by sharing his blood. The therapist helped her understand that choosing to be different was what mattered. Mom decided to update her will after everything we'd been through. She found an attorney through a friend at church, someone with no connection to Robert or his schemes. They spent 3 sessions going through every detail, adding safeguards against financial exploitation and making sure nobody could ever challenge her wishes. She made me executor and added specific language about the house staying in the family. She even included a clause that anyone who contested the will would forfeit their inheritance completely. We held a small gathering at Mom's house on a Saturday evening in April, just the family who'd actually shown up when we needed them. My cousin brought her kids who ran through the halls Dad had framed. Mom's sister made Dad's favorite pot roast using his mother's recipe. We raised our glasses in the living room where Robert had once sneered at our loss. Someone proposed a toast to Dad's memory and to surviving everything Robert had tried to take. The house felt warm and safe again, like it had when Dad was alive. That night, after everyone left, I stood in my living room looking at a photo photo from when I was 10. Dad was teaching me how to use a level on a piece of lumber, his hand steady on my shoulder. Below me, the basement sat empty and quiet, no longer housing the man who'd laughed at our grief. Mom called to confirm plans for next Sunday's dinner, her voice strong and clear like it hadn't been in years. I looked at Dad's photo again and thought about everything he'd built that we'd managed to save. The house he'd framed with his own hands still stood solid. The family he'd loved had survived and grown stronger. And the man who'd mocked his death at his own funeral now sat in a cell, paying for his greed with his freedom. Some justice takes time to arrive, but when it does, it's worth every minute of the wait. Thanks for letting me question things right alongside you. It's been quite the journey wondering together. Until we cross paths again. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.